we may think of, a typical definition of solidarity as something like collective action based on recognition of shared interest. That's kind of a very broad definition. But, what is the problem of solidarity as you see it, Mia?
Yeah, so I think that there is a kind of philosophical, political, theoretical problem of solidarity that I also recognize from my experience, trying to organize, with which I began the essay, and you kind of stated it really concisely in your introduction. The problem is that, if we recognize solidarity between some social groups that are differently situated within a society that is structured by domination as necessary to redressing the sources of domination, then there's a kind of cruel paradox insofar as actually existing injustice seems to preclude the possibility of solidarity between differently situated social groups, both by pitting different groups against each other, and by, creating a situation in which they might not have the same interests, right, or recognize that they have the same interests or motivations, right, for getting involved in organizing. So that's, a statement of a one version of the problem of solidarity. And then I think, political theorists and philosophers debate about what can be the possible grounds of solidarity between differently situated social groups, given this kind of paradox. And, there are maybe roughly 4 answers to that question, all of which I think are reflected in my essay. One is shared material interest, right? We have to find the places where interests do overlap and organize people around those issues. Another is identity. So that identity is the most reliable source of solidarity. Morality is a third, and I think morality sometimes is, invoked as a way to create a broader kind of solidarity between people who have different identities. And then the last might be something like ideology, or a vision of kind of the world that you're working towards building, that is beneficial to everyone involved, would be better for everyone involved. But so I talk about this, I began with this problem in the essay, but then, I kind of, and I do recognize this problem in my experience as an organizer, as a non-professional, amateur organizer. But also, reflecting on my experience of organizing, I see a different problem and perhaps a simpler one today on the left in the US. And so my take on the problem of solidarity today that I spend most of the essay discussing is that we lack both the kind of organizations, the organizational infrastructure, and the capacities, like the social capacities that are necessary to figure out what it is that we all have at stake in the struggle against racial capitalism, and to forge connections between, those motivations, which are, multiple and simultaneous. And to try to forge a shared vision of the world that we're fighting to build. And I think the reason for this that Dan talks about in his essay is, it's historical. And, I think it's the product of 4 decades of neoliberal capitalism that has done a great deal to undermine both the kind of organizational infrastructure that we need in order to build strong left-wing political organizations, and also the capacities that we need to organize across difference in a sustained way. And so some of those capacities that I see as really lacking, now today, in myself and in others, are first, just the capacity to show up to meetings consistently, or to follow through on your commitments to a collective, rather than, pursuing our own careers, our own professional ambitions, our own self-care, right? Like figuring out how to just show up consistently for this kind of difficult work. And then also the capacity to endure a certain amount of discomfort and conflict that I think is inevitable in any process of organizing. So those are my basic answers to the question about like, what is the problem of solidarity in general and today here?
Cool. So before handing it over to Daniel, I'll put an additional question which came up in the chat from Rosie is, we've talked about the problem of solidarity, and I'm sure you'll have a lot to say on what Mie just said, but at the risk of asking a very philosophical style question, what is solidarity? Do you have a kind of a neat definition of it, or do you kind of have it as a sort of vague family resemblance style thing?
Is that for me or for Daniel?
I think that's for you.
Oh, for me. Okay. Yeah. So I define solidarity very broadly as collective action towards shared ends, right? And that's not the way that everyone in this volume understands solidarity. So if you read the responses, I think that's one of the major points of difference, is that some people have a much more specific understanding of what solidarity is, and people understand it as like a specifically left-wing or socialist achievement. And I prefer to think of it kind of more sociologically as like a thing that is present in any kind of social formation. And I spend a lot of time in the essay kind of reflecting on my own experiences of one form of solidarity growing up in the Mormon church, right? It's not a form of solidarity that I would endorse, but it is one that I think we should think of in the same category as the kinds of solidarity that we're trying to achieve on the left. And I define it broadly in that way because I think it's actually helpful to be able to see sort of similarities and differences between different kinds of social formations that are perhaps unexpected, but can be useful for thinking about, what it is that we're trying to build.
Thank you. So let's hand it over to you, Daniel. Do you have your own different definition of solidarity, and what are your thoughts on the problem of solidarity that Mie has raised along various dimensions?
Yeah. Thanks, Anthony. I'll absolutely speak to that. I guess I want to just start actually, thanking certainly everyone for joining the Boston Review and the Philosopher convening this, and for taking this on to try to synthesize like pretty wide-ranging accounts from social movements, from different sites of academia about what solidarity is, what the problem is, and then synthesizing those responses. And I really, really encourage people, especially to pick up your essay, because I think it just lays out, even if we don't agree on everything, it clearly lays out things that will benefit by thinking of together. I think if you ask many people who feel connected to social movements, organizers, they'd say at this moment, while they may not agree on much, they would agree that something foundational about putting many, many numbers of people, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people into motion, entering one another's lives around a shared vision, shared ideas, shared connections, is absolutely necessary to arrest the broad kind of forms of social crisis we face. And one of the contradictions or problems is, and I think he names this really well, is, everyone's point of entry into those movements will necessarily be along different lines. Some it'll be as members of unions and workers thinking about their workplace conditions. Some it'll be around other policy issues around reproductive justice, the climate crisis, public goods, education, et cetera. And while we can say they're all tied together in some ways, and that's true, that's not the reason we would all kind of act together. So that's a kind of paradox that I think Mie labels early about the impossibility of solidarity. We're differentiated by identity, by interest, by point of entry, and yet we still need to act in collective ways beyond that. The other thing I'll say is the kind of differentiation and the separation is not by accident. So we can just think about the way work is organized. Think about the UAW strike happening now. even within large workplaces, there's differentiation by part-time and full-time, by contingent and regular, people competing with one another for hours by the site they're working on. Any gig worker turns on an app and is immediately put into competition with other people doing it. If you work at a warehouse, it's the same thing. So the material structure of our economy and our social life is kind of always already anti-solidarity. And we could say in many ways it's both intentional and it's become a kind of cultural norm that we expect. As you said, living under these conditions, you're kind of on your own, right? Don't expect help from anywhere or anyone. You want to address your own precarity, your own fear of humiliation. That's going to come from your efforts and your agency. You might find someone to, connect with, but there's no promise of anything else. And I think this is an area when he talks about social endurance, to be able to respond to that takes, in many ways frames this as the paradox, starting from 2020, and maybe to say more about that, which is this just seemed like a moment when solidarity was on everyone's mind. It cannot go back to the way it was before, right? That's what everyone said. We have to find ways to figure this out and work together. There's no other choice. And there's a part early in the essay where she says that it just, whatever we can say about the impact of that and the longevity and the insights of the movements produced, and it's not, there's, many, many beautiful things happening in that place. A sustained movement, multiracial movement around policing, around carcerality, state violence, it's hard to claim that that was one of the outcomes. So that's the part of the problematic that Mie lays out, right? How did that happen and what happened? And I think part of that in her essay and, my effort to engage it has been, there's these structural conditions that leave us kind of impoverished and unpracticed in doing what we would need to do to be able to sustain it beyond that moment. Yeah, I wanted to maybe just ask you a question, because in the essay, you take us to the moment of kind of being in the street, the sense of isolation that the shutdowns during the pandemic had imposed, and that something felt, and you didn't use the word cathartic, but something felt like a release. And like from your perspective, was that something that what felt like a precondition, like that's what you want to name as solidarity, that feeling of connection and mutuality? Or are you saying it was like something more like a flash in a pan, and it was, it was just never, that was never what was going to sustain people together?
Great. That's a good question. So the question is, do I think that feeling of togetherness and catharsis is an essential precondition to solidarity?
Well, I think, you named it and you said like, look, that's the kind of starting point. From here, we would think many things are possible. And I guess, or maybe I'm wondering what your own thoughts now are, given that, the trajectory it followed as you think back to that moment.
I think that, I do think that one of the reasons that the George Floyd rebellions were the largest protest movement that has ever happened in the United States is that, we were in the middle of a global pandemic and people were feeling, extremely precarious in ways that allowed them to feel empathy and relate to George Floyd's plight, to his murder, but also to that a lot of people were extremely isolated, right? A lot of people were very lonely, and many people have said this, but I think that that need for sociality was one of the things that brought so many people into the street. And I think that need for sociality is one of the reasons that many of us organize, right? And that's kind of what I'm trying to get at in my opening anecdote, or one of the points that I'm trying to make is that, I think we don't all organize for the right reasons all the time, right? So I think there are kind of reasons that people are taught on the left, like this is like what the answer you're supposed to give, right? Like, why do you organize or why do you engage in solidarity with other people? Because you recognize that you have shared material interests that you want to pursue jointly, right? And that's important and powerful, and it's part of the reason for many of us. But I also think that we have a very real human need for sociality that is denied to us in all kinds of ways by the society in which we live, right? And that was, we felt particularly acutely its denial during the pandemic. And I do think that that was like a motivating thing. So I guess what I'm trying to say about sociality as a motivation is that, I think we should recognize that as a need, right? As a material, deeply felt need. And we should try to help people to meet it, right? Through political organizing.
And this gets to another paradox, which is on the one hand, and certainly, typically when people recount their experiences, whether it's in a labor union, in another kind of politically oriented organization, that's the first thing they'll recall, right? The relationships they built, the satisfaction, the sense that you get to kind of see one another and experience one another at their best. That just isn't possible, right, at those other moments. But then part of the paradox, and this is, I think part of the exchange as well, is after that initial moment, as people kind of were returned in different ways to their respective organizations, student groups, racial justice groups, with other issues, the hope might have been, we all see it, it's renewed, it's right in front of us, but something quite different happened. It was often a deep feeling of alienation, suspicion, that there was some kind of competition between people over whose kind of either experiences or voices would be centered. And actually, those things were very, very acute, right? And I experienced them across, a range of organizations, but I heard them even from my friends and, even other kind of professional organizations, other things. So at the moment when solidarity was most clear, the imperative for it was most clear, we seemed so incapable, I shouldn't say we, everyone, but at many sites, of practicing it. And I wonder if you could, talk about social endurance maybe in that capacity.
Yeah, that's a great way of framing the question. So, I don't want to. So, yeah, I do. One of the claims that I make in the essay, and part of the problem of solidarity for me is right now in the U.S. is that we just lived through one of the most remarkable displays of interracial solidarity in our society's history, right? In the summer of 2020, it was the largest protest movement in our history, and it was deeply multiracial. And it was a moment where a lot of things felt possible, and I think were possible, right? And yet, maybe things are shifting now. I'm so excited by all of the solidarity that we see, particularly in the labor movement right now, and in the UAW strike that you referenced. And I think that that's probably in part a legacy, right, of the summer of 2020. And I think, same thing with Juliet Hooker in her response to my essay references the Stop Cop City organizing. Obviously, the summer of 2020 is living on in different ways, and we'll see where it goes. So I don't at all mean to say that, this is a failure that we need to come to terms with. But I do think there's room for self-critique, on the part of all of us who were a part of that movement, right? And I did see in the subsequent couple of years what you're describing, Daniel, just an incredible brittleness kind of to the organizations and movements that emerged from that moment, and a lot. I think a couple of things that I saw were an inability to have conflict openly, sort of conflict avoidance, but also a certain style of conflict that has been very atomizing, actually, and hasn't had the effect of education and sort of making us more useful, that I write about in the essay that Nathan Duford writes about really well in their book. And so that is part of the problem of solidarity today, as I see it, is why did that happen? And to me, I do think that part of it has to do with, as I mentioned at the beginning, the fact that we don't have in place, the kinds of practices and capacities for enduring the forms of discomfort, the forms of conflict that have to emerge, right? That do inevitably emerge in any attempt, in the process of any attempt to change the world, right? And one, one version of that, or one manifestation of that I write about in the essay, is deference politics, right? So I think that what the defining feature for me of the 2 years after the George Floyd rebellion in organizing spaces was the dominance of what's known as deference politics as the main way of trying to forge coalition, right? By deference politics, I mean basically a kind of an ethic that requires that people who are relatively privileged within a collective defer, so suspend their own judgment about political questions and defer to the judgment of people who are relatively oppressed, right? And a lot of people have written about deference politics, in the years since, especially, Olufemi, I'm thinking, and I draw a lot on Olufemi Taiwo's work in the essay. There are a lot of, to me, there are a lot of problems with deference politics. I think there are moments when it makes sense to defer to people on different questions, but as a whole, I think it's a really dangerous way to try to build coalition. And the main critique that I have of deference politics in the essay is that I think it's a mode of conflict avoidance, right? It's a way of evading the possibility of conflict between differently situated people and groups of people that precludes us from all figuring out what it is that we each have at stake, right? Regardless of our identity, in the struggle against racial capitalism and forging connections between those needs, right? And so I think as the result is that it makes organizations very brittle, very fragile, and it also, it makes people, not very reliable as like long-term organizers. So I think a lot of people came to the left and joined organizations, in the wake of the George Floyd rebellions. And as is to be expected, right, that, that didn't all last. But I do think that maybe we could have had a bit more endurance, right, if all of those people knew why they were there, right? Like if everyone had the opportunity to kind of figure out like what it is that they have at stake, right? So yeah, those are kind of a long-winded answer, but those are some of my thoughts.
Yeah. And I wonder if we might just, also talk for a moment. You talk, I mean, both of us are now in higher education. And so part of the role and sites where this plays out is in the classes, what we hope the classes, the kind of work it does for us and for students. And certainly this is, it's one small corner of higher ed in general. But I was at an academic meeting recently, actually, and a longtime organizer from the South kind of posed a question to the ethnic studies faculty there when she was describing the challenges she was facing. And they had a long record of working with student interns and organizers and helping to, bring them into movement work. And she said, many of the issues you're describing, people being really kind of hesitant to give anyone any grace or space to work through issues, that there was kind of, if you're not right there with me, if I don't see myself kind of mirrored in our first interaction, I need to cut you off for the sake of the better good, right? Because otherwise I'm kind of permitting or facilitating bad ideas. And the organizer said to us, she said, what are you teaching them? And, at first I took this as a kind of lament, like, oh, it's a generational thing. Students need to do something different. But, the question was posed at us. It was posed at, kind of at the site of the classroom and learning about social movements. What is it we're failing to do? And the kind of reproductive justice organizer and, Professor Loretta Ross has mentioned that it's like we've had the capacity to teach about ideas, but not the skills to use them. And both come together. And so I wondered if you could talk, you talked actually in your piece about the, using social movement videos and the Rainbow Coalition in the late 60s to try to model sets of practices that just increasingly don't seem accessible.
Yeah.
And I certainly, this is not a kind of like complaint, students need to do this instead of that, but many of the ability to practice solidarity, right? Outside, to enter into social movements, to stay connected with people who they don't immediately know is really denied to them. So what are your thoughts about how we, even just as this is one site, kind of start to practice this? Ruth Gilmore, I reference this quote, she says, the power of literacy to make us fit for struggle needs to be exercised like a muscle, not waved around like a membership card, right? And Gilmore always says this, practice makes so, we gotta practice, practice, practice. But I'm sometimes, in these settings when social movements themselves have been under such duress and attack, the opportunities to practice it are so limited. So what are your thoughts about that, and how have you, I'm curious also about the kind of use of those films, what are you trying to help students potentially see?
I mean, I feel I've been a professor for, this is my third year, and I learned pretty quickly that the only way to teach a successful class right now to my students, I don't think all students are the same at every school, but for my students is to create a sense of that there's a shared goal that we have, that there's something, usually in teaching, it's like a question that we're trying to answer that is meaningful to them, right? And that through, trying to forge a kind of comradeship amongst the students, right? So that, we need each other, we're trying together to figure out, the answer to this question, right? So there's a project that we're engaged in that matters to us. And then to try to develop relationships of trust, mutual trust, and just a basic level of respect between myself and the students, but also between the students. I realized very quickly that was super important, that unless they actually trust each other on some level and feel like they're doing something together that matters, that we can't really learn anything. So that's actually a huge amount of my pedagogy is trying to build relationships between my students. And then, relatedly, I teach a class. I happen to write and teach about organizing. So and BARD has a very kind of experimental and engaged curriculum. So I'm able to teach some classes that have engaged components. And I teach a class on political organizing. And one of the things that, my students have to do for the class is go canvassing, right? And to me, that's just extremely important for them, whether or not they continue to organize, but building that skill of being first of all, you have to show up, right? You said to this organization, you were going to show up at this time, did you actually show up or not, right? And also, then they have to talk to strangers all day, right? And they have to have conflict with strangers sometimes, right? And they love it. I think almost universally, they have a really positive experience, and I think they want that kind. I mean, I'm speaking for them, and maybe some of them are here and they can speak for themselves, but I think that they want that kind of contact with strangers, right? And with other people. And they want the opportunity to try to convince people to get on board with something that with the way in which they're, experiencing the world and trying to change the world. But it often feels very inaccessible to them. So I do think that building those muscles is a really important part of what I feel like I can do as a teacher.
Yeah, I think that just resonates a lot in many organizer training programs. There's an immediate component where we're trying to get people out onto the doors, into workplaces, talking to people. And a lot of that is kind of getting over a lot of the things we've been taught about suspicion, a certain kind of cynicism about people's capacity to move, about that vulnerability. And precisely as you say, without fail, every time, of course, you'll talk to people who don't have the time or space or interest in talking, but there's also many, many times when people are willing to do that. And I think what you're affirming is the value of that, experiencing that, talking to someone you don't know and working through something and finding a connection that is deeply, deeply meaningful and valuable. And I think of in new labor union organizing campaigns, when organizers at a group of workers that are thinking about organizing, will often say, the union doesn't start when we have an election or get cards or get recognition. It starts today. It starts in how we act and interact with one another, and then thinking about small but escalating collective actions to continue to try that out. Everybody wearing a button one day at work, bringing a petition to the boss, presenting cards together. It's not just the forms of power it demonstrates, but it's something that transforms in people in a atomized society that's constantly pushing them away from one another and getting them to be suspicious. So I think that's, you know, something you're talking about, thinking about how we practice it in these moments as being so important. Yeah.
Thank you. That was such a great exchange. I was glad to be kind of there in the background. I guess we're very close to the Q&A, so I thought I would ask one very broad question, put it first to Mie and then to Daniel. In a sense, it's an opportunity perhaps to crystallize a lot of the themes we've been talking about. The question is, what do we most need from a theory of solidarity today?
For me, the answer, I mean, I think the answer is we need an account of how to cultivate endurance, right? How to cultivate some kind of durability, because you know, we can't unlearn the habits of isolation, of suspicion, of competitiveness that we've learned in every aspect of our lives, you know, through a single conversation or a social media exchange or whatever, right? Like, we can only unlearn those things and learn new habits and capacities through ongoing practice with other people in the course of trying to advance a shared goal, right? And so I think we need, you know, I appreciate and I engage a lot with Nathan Duford's recent book, Solidarity and Conflict, where they make the case that, you know, we need to appreciate and make space for conflict as an essential feature of solidarity. But I think that it can't just be any kind of conflict, right? It needs to be conflict that takes place in the context of an enduring relationship that's mediated by an organization. And so we need to figure out, you know, we need, from a theory of solidarity, you know, answers to the question of how do we stick together, not forever, maybe, but for long enough to be able to make a change, you know, to the world, right? And to ourselves.
That's really helpful. I'll just add, I don't have a kind of a larger, you know, answer to that, but I do think that some of what's happened in the last couple of years is, as you know, the critique and the sense that the prevailing institutions that we inhabit and face are profoundly limited, right? They're not going to save us. The kind of everyday violences that just people see around. The notion that like better days are coming just on their own, you know, it's like very few people subscribe to that anymore. And I think given that, you know, and I think the pandemic and all of its failures and crisis really reinforced it, the hope that there might be some space, my classroom, my organization, my union, you know, even a set of, you know, kind of political friends that would be a kind of sanctuary against that. That would be, you know, free of that, and that we could develop something here that I could be anchored in before having to go out and, you know, confront what's out there. And that makes sense for many, many reasons why we don't want to reproduce what's out there in here. And yet, I think as said, that's also kind of impossible, because we're all going to bring both our ugly parts, our parts that are uncertain about one another, our own insecurities, our own failures into those spaces. So it's not just enough to hope for some place that's altogether has managed to expel all the contradictions and all the problems and uneasiness. And I think that endurance is part of that as well, which is that if we want the real joy of solidarity, that is not, you don't just declare it and expel the demons away. They'll come in with us. And part of it is the capacity to understand that that's like it's central to the work in that way. And so, and I think I've, even in, you know, just the context of teaching, have, you know, now approach things differently, where I can't just say, you know, in here we have, you know, none of these things follow us, right? We have safety or something. It's just not true. And it's a disservice to people entering the space to promise them that in some ways.
Fantastic. Thank you for those answers to that final question. Also for the conversation generally, which was really great. I like this phrase in Daniel's essay, the craft of solidarity. I suppose it's interesting to think of it as a craft. I'm not sure how I even think of it, but I've never really thought of it in those terms. And I like the way you were talking about things like grace and these Mia was picking up on. So anyway, thank you. It was a really great to engage with this forum. And anyway, I'm going to move on to the questions. First one, will the video be posted online? Yes. Unfortunately, I'm not quite speedy enough to do the link and everything, but if you just type in the Philosopher YouTube, you should find it, or it'll go on the Boston Review site. So let's go on to Jeff. The next question. Jeff's question: often social movements are cross-cutting as far as generations and education, etc. How are we to achieve solidarity when some comrades have an expectation of hierarchy and or privilege? Is solidarity even possible in the face of these? So as with the initial questions, we'll go with Mia first and then Daniel to follow up.
My answer to Jeff is yes, it is possible. I don't know. I just immediately think of examples in my own life. But I think it just usually involves conflict, I guess, is the simple answer, right? It involves some form of being able to say, listen, like the way that you're behaving right now is inappropriate to a democratic organization, and figuring out together, like, what are the norms according to which you want to make decisions collectively, right? And that's like difficult, but I think that, one of the reasons it's difficult is that and Sarah Schulman, who's in the forum, has written a book about this, but we tend to, we're trained to respond to conflict as, something extremely aggressive or threatening. And, sometimes I experience in organizing spaces, both kind of, sometimes people will have a perception that they're being canceled when they're not being canceled, they're just being critiqued, So I think that we that's what we have to contend with. And that's why I think endurance matters, because if you tell someone, if you express, concern about the way that a person relates to hierarchy or whatever, you need to be able to show up for the next conversation with that person, right? And give them, as Daniel says, grace, right? Or give the opportunity for people to change, right? And to come around. We don't get or give each other a lot of those opportunities. And they're really important.
Yeah. I would just add to that, I would agree with all and say that I think there's also then a skill in being in organizations and figuring out how to do that so that people don't feel, the sense of, again, humiliation that we all fear is, kind of lurking around the corner. You've written elsewhere about the great Ella Baker and, the role. And, it's why it's also like social movement histories, certainly during the civil rights movement, books like Charles Payne's I've Got the Light of Freedom, which kind of pierced the notion that there was just a singular Southern working class Black community always already in line around every idea, vision, experience, but in fact, all the tedious, careful work it took place for people to find one another, to come to understand each other's experiences, to figure out what they wanted. And that's as much a practice of organizing and movement building as being able to call through a list and invite people to come to a meeting, figure out a demand, et cetera. And I think that part, that kind of facility in it's not just, I guess I'm saying, a set of norms or mores that we can put up in the front of the room and say, everyone, let's agree to give each other grace. It's actually having experience of, when someone was close to feeling this is touching something really hard for me, and there's ways to bring people back in around kind of shared goals. So that, and I would just agree, absolutely. Difference is never, ever the enemy of solidarity. And the identities that cohere us together and give us a sense of we are always produced through collective action. They're not the precondition of it, they're the result of it. But it is a skill and a practice to be able to help all, for us to help one another to do that.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to move on to a question by Naomi Sheeman. Hello, Naomi, and thanks so much for taking part in one of our events just yesterday. So Naomi's question is, do you think that part of the problem is making some signs of solidarity appear to be easy? So, for example, just use people's chosen pronouns, it doesn't affect you. Anything easy isn't doing the real work, and we have to confront and discuss how our lives and worlds will be changed for the better, but not painlessly. And focus on using the right words feeds the right-wing anti-woke agenda. So I guess the question there is whether maybe gestures towards solidarity make it appear to be easier than it is, and whether that feeds the anti-woke agenda. That anyway, I hope you got the gist of Naomi's question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that there is a problem with equating solidarity with gestures, right? Equating solidarity with, having a yard sign, in front of your house, or even like donating money to a cause, or using the right language, in person or on social media, right? I think we should think of solidarity as something stronger than that, right? As collective action, right? Towards a shared goal. And I think we should, but that I don't think that means that those things are bad, right? That any of those things are bad, obviously. But I think that there is value in kind of making distinctions between different kinds of, expressions of empathy, or like expressions of support, and engaging in sustained action together with people to try to redress oppression and domination, and to build a more free world, right? So those are my brief thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would just add in the Boston Review issue that's not a part of the forum, but Kelly Hayes and Miriam Kaba have a really, I think, really, really provocative and important piece about, that it's not about the kind of control and mass, fluency in a certain kind of language. Like, that's not the point. And gestures towards the forms of social endurance that he describes. But I do think there's a way that the language has become like, it's just something you say and do, you just know, and we haven't taken as much time. So if we think about, like, even, pronouns or land acknowledgements, they come from very, very important political traditions and concerns and critiques of the way power works. And they could be sites for us to think about those together. It's okay not to know about those, right? It's not like all of us are left impoverished, people educated in the US, not knowing about, those forms of settler colonialism, theft, et cetera. So I think the concern is when it becomes something that's just ticked off, and it's the kind of resolution of something rather than the start of something, to think about land, its origins, people's relationship to it, the kind of like ongoing effects of that, as ways to engage in conversation, and the same ways to think about how gendered language works across many sites, about how it is often a site of violence, about dignity and personal dignity that's attached to forms of self-description. So that's ways where I think language can actually open us up to one another. But when it's just treated as something that is either something you have or don't have, I think is where it kind of produces the effect, Anthony, that the question registers.
Thank you so much. So the questions are flooding in, and my mind is really struggling to keep up. So I'm afraid I'm going to go for the shorter ones. I'm really sorry to some of you sent the longer ones in, but I just haven't got the sort of capacity to read them all as they come in. So I'm just going to go for a very short and very big question by Su Ming Ku, who asks, would either of you like to comment on the relationship between solidarity and inequality? So big scope. Mie, do you fancy having a stab at that one?
To comment on, sorry, the relationship between solidarity and inequality. That is, I mean, I would like to know more what this person has in mind. But I think that my mind goes to Jodi Dean, I guess, and to her essay on comradeship, and the idea that solidarity for Jodi, I think, you know, and the relationship of comradeship that instantiates solidarity is meant to instantiate also a form of political equality between people who are on the same side of a shared struggle, right? And I think that I reviewed Jodi's essay years ago and have thought a lot about it and taught it a lot. And so maybe not to answer your question, but to pose a question that I have still about solidarity is, you know, yeah, how I think a challenge of solidarity is how to reckon with the real forms of inequality that exist between us, right? Given the ways in which we are situated in a society structured by domination, right? How to reckon with those real existing forms of inequality while also trying to instantiate what Jodi calls the ego ideal of comradeship, right? Of equality and a certain kind of sameness, right? And I think it's hard and it's tricky in a lot of ways. And I don't know that I have like one stop shop kind of answer to how to work that out. But it's a kind of tension that I think you need to keep in view, right? In organizing and in trying to figure out how to form organizations that are you know, that are internally, how to think about the internal power dynamics of political organizations that are engaged in trying to change the external world.
Yeah, I would just add to that, you know, obviously the inequality is part of the, you know, sense of partitioning and alienating people from one another. So because that will directly inhibit solidarity, right? If people are occupy different material locations. And I think the language around both kind of like privilege and self-awareness of it has failed us because it individuates it. It's like it's a personality quality as opposed to where we're positioned in relationship to one another. Just one thing to add on to that is that those positionings then make us predatory on one another. And so, you know, an example of that is, you know, and I'll just as quickly, you know, these Wall Street firms have just been going on this huge spree of buying up single family houses in the wake of the 2008 crash, taking them off the market as sales and then renting them to people. And it's just it's plundering equity from communities all over the country. And it's directly responsible for the housing shortage now. It's just going into kind of hedge funds. And there was a story about this recently in the Times, and someone outraged about what was happening to their neighborhood. And then they were asked, well, would you invest in one of these firms? And the person said, absolutely, the returns are great. And it shows, and you know, for many of us in education, our retirement monies and investments are in these same funds that are doing it. So that's part of how inequality and partitioning impede solidarity, because we're incentivized actually to think about what we can get, you know, through predation off of one another, rather than thinking about a relationship of, you know, that's far more reciprocal and mutual. And it's hard to opt out of, as that kind of story suggests.
Thank you. So here's a question from Mohammed Velji, who references Dean Spade, who makes an interesting claim about conflict, that when mutual aid groups split, this may normatively not be a bad thing, because if the two groups' goals are different, they can fill two different niches. I don't know what it's like Nietzsche. I was wondering what the panelists thought about this claim by Dean Spade. Mie?
Oh yeah, hi Mohammed. We've met before. Nice to see you here. I think that there's a lot of value in organizations having an so I'm going to use that. I've been participating in some of these left roots strategy sessions that have been happening in the previous weeks, and one of the ideas that's been discussed a lot that I really agree with is that there's a lot of value in having an ecosystem of left organizations, right, that are all oriented towards a shared horizon of socialism, but that might be pursuing based on different strategic analyses, right? Different analyses of the current moment that we're in, the current conjuncture, and correspondingly different strategies, right? I think that if we're honest with ourselves, none of us really knows how to get from here to the revolution, right? There's a huge gap. And so, to some extent, we have to try and experiment with different strategies, right? And what I would like to see more on the left is a kind of just mutual respect and appreciation and generosity across different tendencies, across different organizations that are engaged in different experiments, right? And less of a sense of competition, right? A sense that there's like a scarcity that we are all competing over of resources or of, I don't know, righteousness or whatever it is, or correctness. So in short, I think that there can be moments where, an organization might realize we have two competing strategies that we're trying to implement, right? Maybe it's better to do these separately and collaborate, right? In moments that it makes sense, right? To find ways of supporting each other's work. Maybe some of us are doing electoralism and some of us are doing mutual aid, but there can be opportunities for mutual support and for appreciation as opposed to, denigrating and tearing each other down.
And I just want to make a quick comment as it relates to mutual aid. I mean, I think at their best, one of that's been produced by mutual aid projects in Connecticut and Hartford. There's a group called Hartford Deportation Defense that just does this so incredibly well. Has been to show that people actually have all the skills in their experiences to engage one another precisely in the terms that Mie just said. By cooking together, by finding, support for one another, by connecting through phone trees, et cetera. That's not something that one has to teach. People have that in their collective experience. And I think it's an important reminder that all of the qualities that we're talking about here, they're not simply going to trickle down from a treatise or an article. They're very much in many people's everyday experiences about, sense of care and reciprocity and, concern. And I think figuring out how we draw on that and organizations are oriented towards those practices that are very much within our experiences is something, it's an opportunity in front of all of us.